Hi, and welcome to this live chapter reading from Unlikely in Love by Olivia Sherwood, and this is presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Chapter 1. Damn the stupid pantyhose. Annabelle Cleaver knew sitting in a lawyer's office listening to her granny's last will and testament being read would be hard. Wearing pantyhose under the only skirt she owned while the sweltering Oklahoma summer sun beat down on the roof of the ancient building, making the temperature rise at least 10 degrees inside, was even harder. She'd tried to discreetly pull on the pantyhose that had already started to creep down her legs. Double damn! Why on earth did she have to get the thigh-highs instead of a regular pair she could practically pull up to her eyebrows? It wasn't like she had anyone to see the sexier pantyhose anyway. Hell, why did she have to wear pantyhose at all? She felt a trail of sweat running down her back and underneath her bra. The box fan in the corner of the lawyer's office was doing nothing but circulating the stifling air. Harry Donovan sat at his desk, his bifocals perched on the end of his nose, an ever-present bow tie choking his neck. Annie wanted to pull on the collar of her gray sleeveless blouse in empathy. He looked like an English bulldog whose collar was 2 sizes too tight. She rolled her eyes and refrained from sighing. Harry, who'd probably been around when Lincoln was alive, was having a hard time reading the words of the will, even though he was the one who typed it. Why in the hell was she stupid enough to wear pantyhose? She thought for the millionth time in the 15 minutes she'd been in the office. Other than her, Harry was the only person in the room. She could have worn a pair of cutoffs in her Lake Parker tank top, and it wouldn't have made a difference. To him, she was probably just the blur sitting in the chair across from his desk anyway. He could have been reading Granny's will to a llama for all he knew. This time, Annie did let out an audible sigh. Harry wasn't the problem. The ridiculous heat wasn't the problem. Even the stupid pantyhose weren't the problem. The problem was her granny was gone. Annie would never again see her cuss out the rabbits that liked to steal carrots out of the garden. Granny would never get to haggle the price of Mr. Grant's nicest pumpkin from his garden down to $2.50 because Granny knew his darkest secret. Why Mr. Grant gave in to her granny was anyone's guess. Everyone in town knew he liked to dress up in his wife's lingerie while she was out of town at realtor conventions. Annie refused to let the tears spill down her cheeks. Her granny would be too disappointed in her. "Clever women do not cry," she heard her granny's voice say. Besides, it was just the reading of the will, not the actual funeral. She hadn't even started thinking about that. Lord knew she didn't have the money for anything extravagant. She barely had enough for the upkeep of Granny's 100-year-old farmhouse and 10 acres of land perched on the outskirts of Parker, Oklahoma, a tiny town located on the southernmost tip of Parker Lake. A man by the name of Hamilton Parker was one of the first men to stake his land during the Oklahoma Land Run in 1889. He named his parcel of land Parker because he was a narcissistic asshole who got his wife and 2 sons to claim the parcels next to his, thus ensuring he had more land than anyone else in the state. He even had the balls to name the lake on his parcel of land after himself. At least that's how the story went. Annie didn't know if it was true or not. Since all the people who participated in the run were long dead, the only sources she could rely on were Bert Gallagher and Marty Sampson, the 2 old codgers who played checkers in front of Sadie's Cafe every morning. The only thing Annie knew about her town for sure was the nearest Walmart or Aldi were 15 minutes away. The small grocery store in town charged triple the price for anything in it, and the few places to get anything to eat without it coming from a person's kitchen closed at 7 o'clock. Even though Annie's last name was the same as Beavers, the iconic television character from the 50s, Annie didn't have Ward and Junice parents. Instead, she had a drunk for a father who, after spending an entire evening at Griff's Bar, accidentally drove his truck off a bridge. Soon after, her mother left for God knows where, claiming she couldn't be a mother to a kid who looked just like her dead husband that used to knock her around when he was drunk off his ass. So, Annie had moved from her family's single-wide run-down trailer on the wrong side of the tracks to her Granny Sophie's farm at the ripe old age of 10. She had never even officially met Sophie until the day the social worker dropped Annie off at the farm. Annie's mother and Granny, who was Annie's dad's mom, had a falling out before Annie was even born. About what Annie's mom would never say. All she would tell Annie was Sophie was crazy and they were better off not knowing her. One time, when Annie was about 7, she heard her mom yelling at her dad that she didn't want some batshit crazy woman with voodoo eyes putting a curse on her. Her dad, being in a drunken stupor most of the time, didn't argue. He didn't talk to his mom. Why would he care if his kid did? Annie was paralyzed with fear when her mom walked out on her. She was afraid they would ship her to a big town where she didn't know anyone and make her live with strangers. Instead, her quirky 75-year-old granny, who had just buried her husband 2 weeks prior to her son driving his truck off a bridge, had taken Annie under her wing and shown her how to run the farm. Annie learned how to milk the Jersey cows, Bambi and Thumper. She gathered eggs from the Disney princess hens, Aurora, Snow White, Ariel, Belle, and Cinderella. She delivered Cruella the pig's piglets and learned how to scare the coyotes away by shooting her dearly departed granddad's ancient Remington rifle her granny named Pongo. She even became a true farm girl, learning to ride the sole horse on the property, a beautiful palomino named Maleficent. What could she say? Her granny was a sucker for old Disney movies. It was probably why everyone thought she was crazy. Name a pig after a Dalmatian skinny villain, and people tend to think you have a few screws loose. Annie had caught her granny singing Cruella the pig instead of Cruella de Vil more times than she could count. Crazy or not, her granny had lived to be 91. Granny was the only mother Annie knew. She had explained to Annie what a period was and given her the birds and the bees talk when Jimmy Newton asked Annie to play train. She had listened to Annie cry when the first boy, ironically Jimmy Newton, broke her heart. She had watched Annie walk across the stage for her high school graduation and helped Annie fill out the scholarships for the small community college in Lakeview, the town 40 minutes from Parker. Annie had hoped to settle down and have grandkids before her granny went to be with the man upstairs. Instead, here she was, a 27-year-old college dropout with not a man or baby in sight. Of course, Sophie left you the house and 10 acres, seeing as you are her only living relative, Harry said in a warbling voice before hacking a phlegmy cough. Ew, Annie shuddered. She just hoped he didn't hawk a loogie in the trash can. If he did, Annie would walk out of the office and not look back. To hell with the will. Henry pulled out the collar of his shirt, sweat running down his temple. Annie had the urge to reach across the desk and yank the purple and yellow plaid bow tie out of his collar and toss it in the trash can. The good manners her granny taught her, however, whispered in Annie's head to behave herself. So, instead of ripping the bow tie off the ancient lawyer, she placed her hands under her butt and prayed the reading of the will wouldn't last much longer. She also left you the mineral rights to some land just west of town, he continued. What mineral rights? What land? Annie asked. This was news to her. She thought her granny only had the 10 acres where Annie had grown up. And what exactly are mineral rights? Mineral rights give the landowner, in this case your grandmother, the right to sell or profit from minerals or oil extracted from the ground. Many people allow oil companies to lease the mineral rights and extract the minerals or oil from the land in return for the royalty income of the revenue. That's what your grandmother did. She still owned the land. The oil company just leased the mineral rights. Does that make sense? A little, Annie replied. Do I have to do anything with them? No, the company who drills will just send you a check whenever they drill for oil or minerals and make a profit. Your grandmother put the royalties she received in the bank in a savings account for you, he replied. Okay, Annie said. So I'll just get random checks in the mail? That's right. Your grandmother inherited the land from her father when he died. She's been putting that money back for years and has saved quite the hefty sum. Annie shrugged her shoulders. I'm not worried about the money. I know you aren't, dear, but you'll probably be surprised at the amount. I guess I'll need to know it sometime. Might as well be now, she said. With the oil market currently struggling, Annie didn't even think the amount would be too much, even though her granny was a tightwad when it came to her money, and she'd supposedly been saving this money for years. Annie used to find mason jars hidden in random places all over the house. Granny said she didn't trust banks not to take her money and run. When Annie was a teenager, she finally convinced her granny to deposit her granddad's retirement money from the tire plant in Lambert for years into an account at First National Bank of Parker. She managed to save around $2 million, give or take, Harry said. I'm not sure of the exact amount. You'll need to ask the bank. Annie nearly swallowed her teeth. Come again? She squeaked. Because I thought you just said $2 million. That's because I did say $2 million. Remember, she inherited the land from your grandfather, so it's been in your family for quite some time. Your grandmother has been saving this money since she was in her 20s. Throughout the years, when the oil booms hit, she was sometimes getting $10,000 a month. Sweet baby Jesus, Annie muttered, fanning herself with her hands. That was a lot of money. The sweat started pouring in rivulets now. The heat of the day, partnered with the realization she might possibly be a millionaire, had her feeling like she might pass out. Here's the number for the account and a copy of the will saying you are the beneficiary. Congratulations, Annie. It looks like you've just become the richest person in town. Wyatt Holloway groaned as he wheeled himself out from underneath his granddad's 1954 International pickup. Wyatt had been working on the truck for a few months and could finally see the finish line. He had painted the outside of the truck its original baby blue and painstakingly researched on the internet until he had all original, authentic parts for inside the cab. He had just finished installing the carburetor and was waiting for the vintage door handles he had purchased from the eBay shipper Old International Lover 54. Once those were installed, the old truck would be restored to its former glory. "Looking good, son." Wyatt's dad, Kirk, came out of the house and walked toward the barn where his son was working. "Your granddad would sure be proud of the work you've done on Miss Cleo." Wyatt chuckled. "I never understood why he named the damn truck that. He said the best dog he'd ever had was a scraggly mutt that wandered up to the farm while he was plowing the North 40. Almost ran her over, so the story goes. Even after he almost ran her over with the tractor, the dog wouldn't quit following him around. It had a worn tag with the name Cleo attached to the collar. Figured she was someone's dog. Your granddad looked high and low for the owner, but no one claimed her. Finally, he'd quit trying. He said it was probably because she probably got dumped on the farm because the owner wanted to get rid of her. I think it was because he fell in love with the thing, even though it dug up your Meemaw's garden every year and resembled a gremlin more than an actual dog." "Why haven't I ever heard that story?" Wyatt asked. His dad grinned and held a glass out toward Wyatt. "Because you've never asked. Here, drink some of your mom's sweet tea. She made me bring it out here to you and said I had to watch until you drank every last drop." Wyatt looked back toward the farmhouse where he grew up. Sure enough, his mom was at the screen door, arms crossed over her chest and a warning look on her face. He grabbed the glass from his dad and took a long swig. The tea was ice cold and felt amazing, sliding smoothly down his throat. He held the glass to his forehead, sighing in pleasure as the sweat from the glass ran down his temple. Wyatt didn't care what anyone said. The Middle East couldn't hold a candle to Oklahoma's July summer sun. It beat down incessantly, the Oklahoma wind stirring the heat until Wyatt felt like he was baking in an oven. All his buddies in his platoon complained constantly about the sand and the heat when they were stationed overseas. Wyatt would just smile and tell them to visit his farm in Oklahoma in July and they'd understand heat. Wyatt smiled sadly. Some of his platoon members would never make that journey. Mentally shaking off the dark thoughts, he downed the rest of the tea and handed the glass to his dad. His therapist always told him thinking the what-ifs did nothing but stalemate all the progress he'd made. If he could call the shell of a man he now was progress. "Tell Mama I said thanks for the tea," Wyatt said, "but I gotta get back to work." "The truck's almost finished, son. What are you going to do with yourself then? You think you're ready for a job yet?" When Wyatt came back from his third tour in Afghanistan, he was broken. He'd seen and heard things he didn't think he'd ever forget. Things that haunted his dreams no matter how many sleep medications his therapist prescribed him. The cries of homeless little kids and women in bombed cities reduced to piles of rubble. Wrapping a belt around one of his fellow soldiers' thighs to keep him from bleeding out after the mine they drove over exploded and blasted off part of his leg. The dead who returned home in caskets. The scar running down the right side of his face, a constant reminder he was one of the lucky ones who returned home when so many others didn't. Wyatt sighed. "My therapist says I'm not ready. She doesn't think the pressure of having a job is something I can handle right now." "I'm not trying to say I know better than anyone who went to school longer than your niece has been alive, but you're my son. I think I know you a little better than her, and I think you're ready. Not for something big or something stressful, but I think something that would keep you occupied might help." "Well, that's a nice thought, Dad," Wyatt replied, trying to keep the sarcasm out of his voice. He knew his dad was just trying to help. "But where do you suppose I'll find this job in the hopping metropolis that is our town of 3,000 people?" His dad kicked at the clod of red dirt in front of the barn door and shrugged his shoulders. Your mom told me Annabelle Cleaver was looking for help running her granny's farm. She died recently, and rumor has it Annabelle needs lots of help with the upkeep. I think it's become too much for her to take on alone. Who's Annabelle Cleaver? Wyatt asked. The name rang a bell, but he couldn't put a face with the name. She was a couple years younger than you in school, I think. She's Crazy Sophie's granddaughter. Wyatt sighed at the mention of Annabelle's granny's name. His dad was right. Sophie was a crazy old bat. She once accused Wyatt and his friend of smashing her mailbox with a baseball bat. Wyatt didn't do it, but he couldn't get her to believe him. He didn't even know why she was so dead set on thinking it was him. Even so, one day in Swanson's Market, she stopped him in the meat aisle and told him she was going to put a curse on him with her voodoo dolls. Said he wouldn't be able to throw a football for a month. A week later, he had broken his arm in practice and was sidelined for the season. After that, every time he'd see Sophie in town, she'd smile and give him a finger wave. He didn't believe in voodoo, but it still gave him chills thinking about it. Wyatt couldn't believe he'd forgotten Annabelle Cleaver. His dad was right. She was a couple years younger than him, but definitely memorable. Guess that was what 3-year tours in the Middle East got him. He was now forgetting pretty girls. Wyatt didn't tell his dad, but he remembered Annabelle, always smelling like fresh hay and sunshine. After summer break, she always came back to school with a glow to her skin and her hair highlighted with streaks of blonde that could only come from the sun. She had an affinity for wearing long, flowing floral skirts with flannel shirts and cowboy boots. Wyatt also remembered the time she came back from summer break with henna tattoos running up and down her arms in swoops and swirls. Principal Hammond made her go home and wash them off because it was against school policy. Her crazy granny marched herself up to the principal's office and told him she was going to put a curse on him that would shrink his pecker 2 sizes if he didn't let Annabelle express herself in an artistic manner. Principal Hammond never mentioned the tattoos again. He didn't even say anything to her when she dyed her hair mint green. Even though she was strange, Annabelle was definitely a beauty. Legs that went on for miles and sleek-toned muscles that came from the manual labor of working on a farm. But what Wyatt remembered most were her eyes. Big, hazel, and filled with flecks of gold and amber with a dark olive outline, and lashes that curled and touched her eyebrows. Striking. Memorable. He couldn't believe he'd forgotten those eyes. Wyatt's buddy Clark once tried to ask for her phone number and was shot down. The team had given him hell for weeks, joking he got turned down by the strange farm nerd with green hair. Then they'd laugh because the only boy they'd ever seen Annabelle with had been the science geek, Jimmy Newton. He wore thick black glasses and had the biology textbook practically memorized. The team had called him Jimmy Neutron in jest because his name was so close to the nerdy cartoon character on Nickelodeon. He'd even looked like him. He and his buddies were pretty big douchebags. Wyatt and Annabelle definitely didn't run in the same circle. Even in a school as small as Parker High, cliques were present. Wyatt was a jock. He was voted best athlete by his senior class and led the Parker Wildcats to the state championship in football 2 years in a row. The 2 gold footballs won each year were still housed in the trophy case of the high school gymnasium. Wyatt wondered if the school still had his picture kissing the first gold ball in the case. He was offered a small scholarship to play football at the next level, but when the Army recruiter showed up at school and talked to all the boys about enlisting, Wyatt bought in hook, line, and sinker. He knew he wasn't good enough to go pro in football. He was a damn good high school player, but that was it. He didn't want to be stuck in Podunk, Parker, Oklahoma for the rest of his life. He wanted to see the world. That day he signed with the Army and hurried home to tell his parents the good news. His mama had immediately started crying and said her baby boy was going to get shot and killed in a godforsaken country before she could become a grandma. His dad told him how proud he was his son had decided to serve his country, even though Wyatt knew he was holding back tears as well. His baby sister had punched him in the arm and called him an idiot. Wyatt had gotten his wish. He had seen the world. He'd also seen how cruel, unfair, and heartbreaking it could be. I do remember her, he told his dad. She was really smart but a little strange. Pretty much kept to herself except for a couple of girlfriends. I was in a couple classes with her. She always knew every answer the teachers asked. I think she might have even tutored some of the football players. I figured as smart as she was, she would leave this town first chance she got and run off to be a doctor or some other profession really smart people get into. Wyatt's dad shook his head no. She did go to college, but came home shortly after. Sophie caught pneumonia and was in the hospital for 2 weeks. Annabelle came home to take care of her granny and help run the farm. What about Neutron? Who? His dad asked, a puzzled look on his face. If she wasn't with other two friends, there's that boy we'd see her with, a guy named Jimmy Newton. We called him Neutron behind his back because he looked like the cartoon character Jimmy Neutron. And he was just as smart as Annabelle. Boy, y'all were punk asses, weren't you? Wyatt chuckled. That we were. His dad laughed. Well, that Neutron kid went to medical school. Last I heard, he was working at Johns Hopkins trying to find a cure for cancer. Maybe you should have been calling him less names and had him tutor you instead. Lord knows you needed it. You're probably right about that, Wyatt replied. Good for him. So, what do you think? Going to give her a call? Wyatt had to admire a woman who put her family first, but he still wasn't interested. I think I'll try to find something else, Dad, but thanks for the advice. His dad clapped him on the back. The only other thing I know of in town is a stock boy in Swanson's Market. Just something to think about. Wyatt sighed. It would be nice to do something other than hang out with his mom and dad. Living with them was starting to make him crazy. He loved them dearly, but if his mom looked at him sadly and asked him if he was all right one more time, he was going to shit a brick. The only reprieve he got was when his kid sister, Lucy, visited with his 5-year-old niece, Hattie. Lucy had married her high school sweetheart straight out of high school. Jacob was a plumber just like his dad and helped run the family business, Perry Plumbing. Shortly after they married, Lucy had gotten pregnant and was content being a stay-at-home mom for their daughter. Hattie had curly black hair, sky-blue eyes, and the biggest dimples he'd ever seen on a kid. Even better than how adorable she was, the fact his mom became totally engrossed in whatever Hattie was doing when Hattie and Lucy came to visit gave him a much-needed break. I guess I could give her a call, he told his dad. Do you have her number? I don't, and your mom told me Sadie said she doesn't get good reception at Sophie's anyway. It's probably because Sophie buried all the voodoo dolls she had before she died and ruined any cell reception there was, Wyatt thought. I'd just go out there and see what she says, his dad continued. You know where their farm is, right? Wyatt nodded. He did know where it was, even though he most definitely wasn't the one who bashed in her mailbox all those years ago.